Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling tales Pennsylvania has ever seen. With the weight of events that defy rational explanation, the Appalachian Mountains hold secrets that time has never been able to uncover, whispers that reverberate over a century. Please let us know in the comments where you are currently watching us before we start. This film was made entirely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any likeness to real people living or deceased is entirely coincidental. The industrial age was pervasive in Pennsylvania in 1897. Over rapidly expanding cities, factories emitted black smoke, and rural areas continued to be ensnared in antiquated customs, with each remote valley harboring its own unspoken laws. There were entire communities in the state center's mountainous areas that hardly ever saw outsiders. These were areas where the modern world had not yet fully emerged. One of these forgotten areas is where our story starts. At a moment. With its deep valleys and thick forests, Center County was known for its remote farms and villages that hardly showed up on official maps at a time when the boundary between civilization and barbarism was blurred. There were dirt roads winding between oak and pine-forested hills. Additionally, the area became a white maze in the winter due to the snow, making it simple to get lost indefinitely. Those mountains had a certain quality that made them seem unique to visitors. Characterized as repressive, as though the land itself contained memories that ought to be kept hidden. The plot of the story we're going to examine centers on a rural estate called Mielheim, which is miles from the closest town. The family that owned the farm had farmed the land and reared cattle for many generations, leading a nearly self-sufficient life. They were reticent individuals who hardly ever visited the village, and when they did, they avoided making eye contact and spoke infrequently. Locals reported that there was something peculiar about that family, but nobody knew what it was. Maybe their loneliness was the only factor, or maybe there were more sinister causes for their actions. A merchant who was passing through the area in the fall of that year made the decision to pause at the farm and request water and rest. Travelers frequently sought lodging on rural properties during that time, particularly as night fell and the roads became hazardous. The man rapped on the door of the main house, a dark, wooden structure that appeared to be older than. In fact, it seemed as though time moved differently there. They resisted him at first, but after a while they let him in. The first clues to the mystery that would develop over the next few months were sown by what he saw inside that house. With its small windows that let in little light, the interior was gloomy even during the day. The merchant couldn't quite place the strange smell in the air. It was a blend of damp earth, mold, and something else, organic and unsettling. The inhabitants. They moved in an odd way, constantly peering into the shadowy areas of the house as though they were waiting for something to appear out of the shadows. Details that deeply troubled the shopkeeper were observed. There were dark stains on the wooden floor that someone had attempted to remove with little success, scratches on the walls that appeared to have been caused by human fingernails, and marks on the walls. He asked questions about the family and got conflicting and ambiguous responses. The man was positive, but they claimed it was just them there. When he brought up the sound, the muffled murmurs he had heard coming from the basement suddenly stopped. The merchant declined the invitation to stay the night after being given water and a piece of stale bread. All of his survival instincts were triggered by something there, urging him to run while it was still daylight. He hurriedly thanked them and walked off down the dusty path, feeling the family's eyes on his back. When he took one final look back, as he watched him vanish around the bend in the road, he noticed that they were all standing at the door, as still as statues. If it weren't for what transpired over the next few weeks, that seemingly insignificant visit would have been just another forgotten travel tale. Unable to shake the memory of that encounter, the merchant started asking questions in Mielheim's markets and taverns. He learned that others had experienced similar circumstances on that farm, but they all wished to keep it to themselves. There was an obvious fear, a reluctance to explore issues that the elders felt were better left unexplored. The merchant then met an old man who had been in the area for decades and knew every trail. He worked at the local sawmill. Around the campfires, every farm and tale was whispered. After a few pints of beer, the elderly man consented to speak, but even then he was cautious in his word choice, as though he was afraid someone might be listening. The property had a bad reputation, he recalled, originating in the past, when the first people came to live in those mountains. The native peoples who lived in the area prior to the arrival of the Europeans believed that the land where the farm was constructed was already cursed, according to legends that have been passed down through the generations. They claimed that something was present in the rocks, soil, and subterranean waters beneath that particular valley. Instead of camping there, the tribes chose to take lengthy detours on their hunting routes instead of going through that region. When the settlers disregarded these cautions and constructed their houses, they soon learned why the area had been abandoned. When the first families attempted to settle there, they encountered mysterious issues. Cattle became ill without any apparent cause. Even in rich soil, crops rotted. Additionally, people started having unsettling dreams that left them feeling scared and worn out. Many just left, leaving everything behind. However, the low cost of the land always attracted someone who was desperate enough to try again. The household that lived in 1897, the property had been there for roughly 20 years. Additionally, increasingly bizarre rumors started to spread during that period. Mielheim's citizens recalled that on new moon nights, when the mountains were so completely dark that it was impossible to see one's own hand in front of one's face, the family engaged in strange rituals. Sounds that were not associated with any known animal reverberated through the valleys, and pale lights danced among the trees that surrounded the farm. A few hunters, those who dared to approach the property too closely, claimed to have witnessed figures moving strangely, bending and dragging themselves across the ground as though their bodies weren't working properly. When he got to the most unsettling part of his tale, the old man from the sawmill lowered his voice even further. Over the years, he claimed, people had vanished, lone travelers who were last seen making their way to that farm. Naturally, no evidence could be found, and the local authorities consistently closed cases due to a lack of proof. The roads were hazardous. The forests were full of wild animals, and it was not unusual for someone to get lost and never be found. However, the more perceptive could see a pattern, a startling regularity of incidents consistently associated with that particular area. The story became an obsession for the merchant. He had no superstitious beliefs. He had seen a lot of odd things while traveling throughout the state. A primitive part of his brain, however, had been touched by something about that farm. The section that is still. Recalled a time when people were prey rather than predators. He made the decision that he needed to learn more and comprehend the true events that took place there but were obscured by society and the law. He conducted covert investigations over the next few weeks, speaking with residents of nearby villages and looking through old documents in churches and small libraries. He found bits of information that, when combined, created an unsettling mosaic. Personal diaries contained brief and mysterious notes about the farm, implied that others had already attempted to learn its secrets. The notes just stopped without any explanation, and all of these attempts appear to have ended suddenly. The merchant was told about a visit he had made to the property years prior by a retired priest who lived in a remote cabin. After a series of frightening events, the family had asked him to perform a blessing. The details of what the priest saw inside that house were never disclosed, but following that day, he firmly declined to come back. In the years that followed, he experienced a tremor in his hands that medical professionals were unable to explain, and his faith had been shaken in a way that he was unable to articulate. The family wasn't originally from Pennsylvania, the merchant also learned. They had come from somewhere in the South, escaping something that no one was willing to name. Strange customs and beliefs that blended aspects of various cultures in an odd and unsettling way were brought with them. The farmhouse was constructed by them, adhering to an odd layout, with doors leading to dead ends, rooms that lacked architectural logic, and a basement that was too deep for any useful use. The more the merchant learned, the more he realized that this farm was the focal point of something much bigger and darker than he had first thought. In addition to the family, there was a network of secrets that had been woven over decades by some members of the community who would rather keep quiet. Some received compensation to keep quiet, while others were intimidated, and some were just too scared to say anything. That year, winter came early, blanketing the mountains with a deep layer of snow that made traveling on the roads nearly impossible. The merchant had made the decision to remain in Millheim for a longer period of time, staying in a modest guest house that was occupied by a widow who hardly ever inquired. Using binoculars he had purchased specifically for the purpose, he spent his days exploring the area while always maintaining a safe distance from the farm. What he saw only made him more uneasy. The family didn't spend much time outside during the day, and when they did, it was always in a hurried and productive manner, as though they wished to avoid interacting with the outside world. The smoke rising from the building's chimney had an odd, dense, greenish color that spread low over the ground rather than rising normally as they carried heavy sacks to a shed at the back of the property. The main house's windows were illuminated at night, creating shadows that appeared to dance aimlessly. Choreography. The merchant was particularly interested in the cellar. Through a metal grate on the side of the house, he could see the opening, and sometimes he could hear sounds from those depths when the wind was blowing in the right direction. They were muffled sounds like something being pulled across a stone floor, punctuated by what appeared to be random words in a language he didn't understand. At dawn, these noises always stopped, giving way to a thick silence that was even more disturbing. While he was, an old map of the property that was kept in the county office was discovered by the merchant during their investigation. Something intriguing was discovered in the document. Early surveyors referred to the farm's location as a geological anomaly. Hundreds of meters beneath the property was an unusual underground rock formation, a sort of natural cave. According to records, this cave was discovered by early explorers in the region, who promptly sealed it and noted that it was useless. This finding provided fresh insight into the entire circumstance. The house's basement was more than just a basement. It served as a direct entry point to that cave network. Since the family had effectively constructed their home over a subsurface soil entrance, anything that took place there was shielded from prying eyes by meters of solid rock. The merchant started to realize that the real secret of the farm was hidden deep within, out of sight. He concluded he needed assistance. However, locating a willing investigator was almost impossible. There was absolutely no interest from local authorities who consistently cited a lack of hard proof or questionable jurisdiction. The county sheriff was a pragmatic man who only handled land disputes, tavern fights, robberies, and obvious crimes. He wasn't particularly interested in stories about enigmatic farms and subterranean caverns, especially when they featured a family that had never officially caused any trouble. At that point, the trader encountered a geologist who was in the area researching the mountain ranges of the Appalachians. The description of the geological anomalies beneath the property piqued the interest of the naturally curious man. In order to observe from a distance and possibly gather some soil samples from the surrounding areas, he consented to go on a covert expedition with the merchant. Equipped with measuring devices and notebooks for taking notes, they set out on a chilly December morning. The geologist noticed oddities in the surroundings as they got closer to the farm. The flora surrounding the Pusissa property was distinct, more twisted, and sparser, as though something in the soil was impeding the growth of healthy plants. The trees' bark displayed dark patches he had never seen before, and their branches grew at strange angles. The instruments he used to test the soil revealed peculiar mineral composition elements that shouldn't have been present at that concentration. In order to observe the entire property without being noticed, the two men located a high point. They spent hours there recording everything they observed, taking thorough notes and drawings, the emanations from the chimney and other openings around the farm, as well as from ground fissures that appeared to have been purposefully opened, piqued the geologist's interest. He had a suspicion that gases could escape from the depths through these openings, which were connected to the system of underground caves. They saw something as night fell that was beyond the realm of reason. With torches in hand, the family left the house and maid, on their way to the rear shed. When they threw open the doors, they saw an interior filled with a throbbing, strange light. It was not your typical fire. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as though the building had been constructed using materials that had the ability to glow. In a sort of ritual, the family members started moving in unison, following intricate and mesmerizing patterns. Despite being a man of science, the geologist experienced a deep-seated fear. There was a fundamental issue. With that scene, something that defied natural laws in a way that his well-trained mind was unable to comprehend. He muttered to the trader that they must depart now, that they were seeing something that shouldn't be there, something that man wasn't ready to understand. Moving away from that unsettling scene, the two men walked silently down the hill, their footsteps buried in the snow. Normally articulate and self-assured, the geologist was clearly shaken, his face pale even in the dim light of the moon. He informed the merchant that he had devoted his life to learning about the rocks, the earth, and the natural forces that molded the world. However, there was no scientific explanation for what he had seen that evening. The geologist spent hours writing in his notebook after they got back to the guest house, trying to come up with a way to explain what he had witnessed. He brought up theories regarding rare minerals with peculiar optical properties and underground gases that might induce hallucinations. Properties regarding the ways in which solitude and superstition may skew one's understanding of reality. However, his hand shook, and his eyes revealed the truth he didn't want to acknowledge even as he wrote these logical justifications. He had seen something truly beyond explanation. Other odd things started happening in Mielheim in the days that followed. People described having unsettling dreams, seeing pitch-black tunnels that went on forever beneath the ground, and hearing voices calling their names from unbelievable locations. A few woke up with the impression that, despite being in their beds, they had spent the night somewhere else. The community was becoming increasingly uneasy, as though an unseen force was contaminating the tranquility of that forgotten village. The geologist was changing, and the merchant saw it. The man didn't get much sleep, and when he did, he would yell as he awoke, discussing the endless depths and the ancient beings that were watching from the shadows. In the margins of his notes, he started sketching odd symbols and geometric designs that had no Euclidean logic, and from the corner of his eye, the shapes appeared to move. He claimed that these symbols appeared to him as though they were being sent straight from an outside source into his head. The geologist vanished one morning. All of his possessions, including his priceless instruments and research notebooks, were left at the inn. The innkeeper claimed to have witnessed him departing prior to dawn, strolling in the direction of the mountains while maintaining a detached, vacant expression. The store owner set up a search, but there were no footprints to follow, and the paths were blanketed in recently fallen snow. The man seemed to have just vanished into the chilly morning air. The merchant searched for days, extending his search to ever further off places while purposefully avoiding the enigmatic farm. He couldn't help but know that the geologist had been drawn there by some force, but going there now felt like a death sentence and an invitation to become one of the shadows that lived there. Cursed places. He resisted the urge to find out, the morbid curiosity that was threatening to drive him insane. The merchant started going through every notebook the geologist had left behind during this time. Although the early notes were methodical and scientific, they grew more disorganized and unsettling as time went on. The geologist had formulated a hypothesis regarding the farm that combined ancient history, geology, and a phenomenon he dubbed Turic resonance, as stated by. According to his observations, the property's underlying rock formation acted as a sort of natural amplifier for energies that he was unable to sufficiently describe. Because of his research in dusty archives, he had learned that this area of Pennsylvania had a peculiar pre-colonial history. The indigenous people viewed some mountains as portals, locations where the physical world intersected dimensions that should not be entered, according to the diaries of ancient explorers. They carried out complex rites to maintain. To guarantee that whatever lived on the other side stayed there, these passages were sealed. It dawned on the merchant that the farm family wasn't just residing there. Perhaps they were serving something that existed in the depths, or they were defending something. The barn's strange light, the sounds emanating from the cellar, the ceremonies held every night. This whole thing was a part of a bigger, longer-term goal. The family was just the most recent in a long line of protectors or possibly inmates bound to that territory by responsibilities that cut across generations. The merchant started to suffer from the same symptoms that had plagued the geologist as he processed this information. He experienced a persistent presence in his mind, thoughts that were not his own, and nighttime urges to stroll in the direction of the mountains. Fearing what he might do if he let sleep take him, he battled these compulsions by locking himself in his room and making himself stay awake. The line separating reality from something else was getting progressively hazy, because Mielheim had a way of devouring people who asked too many questions. The landau, who saw his decline, advised him to leave right away. Over the years, she recalled, she had witnessed a number of people come to inquire about the farm, but they all quickly left or simply vanished. The area had a method of keeping its secrets safe and getting rid of people who dared to approach the truth that was concealed beneath layers of time and earth. The businessman was aware that he had to depart because every day, Mielheim made it more likely that he would fall prey to that unseen curse. However, he was compelled to learn the truth about what was actually taking place on that remote farm. He used the excuse that he had to locate the geologist to justify his stay, but he knew in his heart that it was something deeper, a morbid attraction that defied reason and self-preservation. He had an unexpected encounter on a cloudy afternoon in January 1898. An old man came into the inn, clad in time-worn clothing and a frayed leather backpack. He identified himself as a tourist who had spent decades exploring the Appalachian Mountains and learning about the lost customs and histories of remote communities. His eyes possessed a wisdom that suggested experiences beyond the norm. And a grim look came to his face when he heard that the merchants were interested in the enigmatic farm. The elderly traveler requested that they have a private conversation away from curious onlookers. They made their way to a deserted chapel. Only the wind and the crows could hear them there, on the edge of the village. The traveler sat on decaying wooden benches there and told a story that chilled the merchants to the bone. The farm, he claimed, was only one of many similar locations strewn across the mountains, where reality's structure was thinner and more susceptible to outside influences. The traveler claimed that there were families strewn across the Appalachian mountain range who maintained perpetual watches over these delicate sites. They had been tainted over time by constant contact with forces that the human mind was not designed to understand, but they were not inherently evil. These individuals had been altered by generations of exposure, becoming something that straddled the line between humanity and something completely different. They kept sealed doors that should never be opened, and carried out their rituals out of necessity rather than choice. The traveler demonstrated to the merchant dozens of points along the mountains on a hand-drawn map. Every mark denoted a place where centuries' worth of records of comparable occurrences had been made. He clarified that these locations were familiar to the pre-European peoples who lived there, and they were revered and feared by them. They constructed their settlements far from these regions, leaving them uninhabited as safe havens between the living world and something that existed in other dimensions. When the colonists arrived, they disregarded the cautions and tales, believing them to be the superstitions of primitive peoples. Without realizing they were upsetting delicate balances that had been maintained for millennia, they constructed their farms and villages. Some quickly realized their error and ran away. Others, however, remained out of desperation or stubbornness, and by doing so, they were progressively absorbed by the energetic patterns coming from the depths, becoming an involuntary component of a system that was much older and far more extensive than any human institution. The traveler sadly shook his head when the merchant asked about the missing geologist. He claimed that those with particularly open and inquisitive minds were especially susceptible to the impact of such locations. Subtle forces were able to enter because of the geologist's obsession with science and his need to explain and comprehend. It was nearly impossible to stop the process once it started. The individual was progressively brought nearer to the epicenter until they eventually crossed the threshold from which there was no way back. The merchant was forewarned by the traveler that he was perilously near that point of no return. The intrusive thoughts, the dreams, and the urge to stay in Mielheim in spite of all the warning signs. These were all signs of psychic contamination. He had to get out of there right away, get as far away from the farm as he could, and never think about these things again. There was information that the human mind was ill-equipped to comprehend, facts that made anyone lose their sanity. Thought about them directly. But when the merchant heard those words, he began to feel more and more resistance. There was a part of him that wanted to believe, that wanted to pack up his things and leave that damned place. But another part, one that seemed to be getting stronger every day, whispered that he was on the verge of making a fundamental discovery, and that to give up now would be to miss a rare chance to see something that very few people had ever seen. Was he speaking out of curiosity, or was he already being manipulated by outside forces? Ideas? He was no longer able to tell. The traveler let out a long sigh, sensing the merchant's internal conflict. He claimed that throughout his life he had witnessed that look in dozens of other people. It was the expression of someone who had already stepped over an invisible boundary and was already more devoted to the opposing side than to mutually agreeable reality. There was only confrontation or total surrender as a means of salvation. Escape was no longer an option. The merchant would have to make a decision, and that decision would have repercussions. That would go beyond his personal life. The traveler continued his journey through the mountains after they parted ways at the chapel, and the merchant returned to the inn with more questions than answers. As it always did in that deep valley, night came swiftly, and with it a tangible uneasiness, as though distant voices were attempting to form words in a language that had been forgotten by time. The wind howled through the trees with a sound that was almost vocal. The merchant stood at the window of his room, looking toward the farm that he was familiar with. Lay, undeniably present, but invisible in the total darkness. The merchant made a choice that evening that would alter the trajectory of all subsequent events. He wouldn't flee, but he also wouldn't give in to his attraction mindlessly. Rather, he would search for a different route that would enable him to solve the farm's mysteries without totally losing his humanity. Even though it was a risky and possibly naive idea, it was the only one that made sense to him. Tormented for weeks after. He spent the next few days carefully preparing after making some unsettling observations and discoveries. He went to Milheim's tiny library and copied every historical document that made reference to the land or the area around it. He interviewed the oldest residents whose recollections dated back decades, assembling tidbits of tales and testimonies that, while seemingly unimportant on their own, revealed a startling pattern. Every bit of data resembled a brushstroke on a bigger picture that was starting to come out of the darkness. He learned about odd tools the farm family had commissioned over the years from a retired blacksmith. They weren't your typical farm tools. Rather, they were oddly shaped tools that were made to precise specifications that were incomprehensible to someone used to traditional farm labor. The blacksmith had never seen blades that required sharpening in his life. Chains with links of different sizes that followed certain mathematical progressions, and hooks bent at impossible angles. 50 years of labor. An elderly seamstress described fabrics that her family purchased in bulk, all of the same kind-heavy, dark materials that were difficult for her to handle. She claimed that after working with the fabric, her hands felt strange for days, as though tiny electric currents were running through her skin, and that the fabric appeared to absorb light in an odd way. She suspected it wasn't for curtains or regular clothing, but the family never gave an explanation for why they used so much of that material. There was a ceremonial aspect to their commands. Additionally, the merchant learned that a supplier from somewhere in the Virginia mountains regularly delivered goods to the farm. The supplier always arrived at night, went directly to the property, and left before dawn, never interacting with the people of Milheim. According to the few who did see him, he was a tall, extremely thin man with eyes that seemed to reflect light in an animalistic manner, similar to that of a wolf or cat, captured in the dark by a flashlight. The trader started to understand that the farm functioned as a node in a much larger network as he pieced together this information. There were links to other comparable locations, a covert network spanning the mountainous areas and run by individuals and families with similar goals. In the traditional sense, it was not an organization. Instead of a formal hierarchy or documentation, there was a shared understanding of responsibilities that surpassed shared allegiances. The merchant was at last prepared to approach directly in the middle of February. He meticulously organized every aspect, selecting a particular time based on his observations of the family's routines. The property appeared to be less active during certain times, when the family retired and the nightly rites stopped, as though they needed to rest after their vigils. He would try to get in touch during one of these times. He composed in-depth letters. He sealed them, recorded everything he had found, and gave them to the landlady, telling her to forward them to the appropriate authorities if he didn't return in 3 days. He didn't think these letters would have much of an impact. At least there would be a record, evidence that someone had attempted to reveal the truth, even though the authorities had already expressed a reluctance to look into the matter. Although it was more of a symbolic than a useful gesture, it gave him some peace of mind, nervous mind. He purposefully strolled along the path that led to the farm on the designated morning without attempting to blend in or be covert. He wanted them to understand that he was not an intruder, but rather someone looking for understanding. The forest was completely silent, and the sky was gray with heavy, menacing snow. In that area, not even the birds dared to sing. Every step he took seemed to reverberate disproportionately, as though the sounds of his approach were amplified by the air itself. As soon as the farm appeared, he took a moment to gather his courage. Compared to his observations at night, the property appeared even more ominous during the day. The buildings were in a controlled state of decay, with minimal maintenance to keep them operational, but no comfort or aesthetic attention. The family seemed unconcerned with unremarkable looks, devoting all of their resources and energy to goals that are hidden from the public. He could feel vibrations coming from the low, continuous hum coming from the shed at the back, even from a distance in his bones. He walked over to the front door and knocked 3 times, the sound resonating oddly inside the house, as though it were much bigger inside than the outside. He felt as though he was being watched through the small, dark windows during the lengthy pause. One of the family members, a middle-aged man with sunken eyes and a pallor that suggested years of inadequate sun exposure, emerged when the door finally slowly opened. Without saying anything, the man merely gazed at the merchant with a look that was a mixture of curiosity and possibly sympathy. The merchant clarified that he had arrived peacefully and was only attempting to unravel the secrets of that country. He merely conveyed a sincere desire to understand the customs and knowledge the family possessed, without mentioning his research or suspicions. He hoped that by being honest he could get access to opportunities that would never be available through deceit. For what seemed like an eternity, the man at the door did not speak, his eyes examining each detail of the guest, as though he could read minds by looking at them. Unexpectedly, the man then took a step back and motioned for the merchant to come in. There were no words or explanations, just that silent invitation, which was equally full of threat and opportunity. As soon as the merchant crossed the threshold and inhaled deeply, he sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The house's air was heavy and dense, not necessarily filthy, but infused with an imperceptible but unmistakable, existing as though imperceptible molecules of an unidentified material were continuously floating in midair. The interior was just as cramped and dark as he remembered it from his first visit, but he could see more details now that he was there consciously. A visual language that permeated every room was created by the symbols and patterns carved into the wood that covered the walls. They weren't haphazard ornaments. A story was being told. A tale that started close to the door and got deeper as it proceeded inside the house. Other family members started to emerge from various parts of the house with that strange movement he had previously noticed, as if their bodies didn't move in a completely natural way, like chapters of a book written in a language that modern humanity had forgotten. They were all 5 of them, with different ages, but they all had that same friend and those deep-set eyes that seemed to see through. Actual surfaces. They arranged themselves around the merchant in a way that was not menacing, but rather resembled a ceremonial circle, a configuration with deeper significance. Finally, the family's oldest man, who appeared to be the patriarch, spoke. The merchant was unable to recognize the accent in his rough, seemingly infrequently used voice. An odd blend of local influences that shouldn't coexist. He claimed that they were aware that the merchant had been observing of all his actions during the previous few weeks. They weren't upset. They actually appeared to be almost relieved that someone had the guts to ask questions directly, rather than merely circulating suspicions and rumors among Milheim's taverns. The other members of the family stood, forming a silent circle around the merchant, who was invited to sit in a worn wooden chair by the patriarch. Their stances showed no animosity, but rather a constant watchfulness akin to that of guardians who never completely lowered their guard. The elderly man started talking, and the weight of generations of seclusion and long-kept secrets was evident in what he said. He claimed that the land itself had already permanently altered the merchant's mind, and that he had already witnessed too much to just walk away and forget. The family had not chosen that life of constant watchfulness, he explained. In a time when the world was different and the lines between realities were less clear, they were descended from people who had made a pact long ago. There, deep within those mountains, ancestors had found something that predated humanity and would persist long after the last human being vanished from the face of the planet. This was neither benevolent nor malevolent in the traditional sense of the word. It was merely extraterrestrial, functioning in accordance with logics that did not exist in the universe that humans were familiar with. The patriarch got up and walked over to a wall with a dark cloth covering a painting. When he withdrew the cloth, there was not a painting, but rather a three-dimensional map engraved into a piece of rust-eroded metal. The entire Appalachian Mountains were depicted on the map, but there were extra layers beneath the surface that represented cave systems and other features. Structures that suggested deliberate design on impossibly large scales, tunnels that shouldn't exist naturally. The precise location of the farm, which was one node in a network spanning hundreds of kilometers, was marked at certain points. He clarified that these, predating both European colonization and the very existence of humans on the continent, underground structures were extremely old. Even those who devoted their lives to studying them were unable to determine who or what constructed them. Resonance points, or locations where the membranes dividing various planes of existence became permeable, were known to be produced by these structures, and there was a risk of cross-contamination between realities that few people could fully understand because of this permeability. That weren't supposed to live together. The merchant listened to all of this with a growing sense of horror mixed with fascination. When he asked the patriarch about the missing geologist, he briefly closed his eyes before responding. He claimed that the man of science had visited them through dreams, called by something that lived in the depths, rather than physically like the merchant. Few people were able to resist when called in that manner. No amount of human willpower could overcome the attraction. Most likely, the geologist was now in the subterranean caverns, discovering tunnels that defied Euclidean geometry, and getting lost on routes that turned back on themselves in ways that were incomprehensible to the rational mind. The patriarch clarified that the family's rituals were carried out to uphold barriers that kept deeper influences from rising to the surface, rather than to invoke or worship what existed below. It was a never-ending, tiresome task that required personal sacrifice and unwavering attention to detail. They had abandoned happy, normal lives, families, and social ties, all in order to carry out a responsibility that has been handed down through the years. They weren't the only ones. Families on other mountains were also working in silence to keep a delicate balance. The merchant questioned why this wasn't brought to the attention of the authorities, and why it wasn't a public issue that could be handled in a less isolated and more structured manner. The patriarch laughed bitterly, a sound that carried decades of frustration and powerlessness. He claimed that although they had previously made several attempts to warn those in positions of authority and wealth, the public didn't want to believe them. Without seeing, they couldn't believe, and seeing entailed condemnation. Those who looked into the issue either became fixated on it, like the geologist, or concluded it was best to ignore it completely. Then the merchant received a surprise offer from the patriarch. He offered to show him the caves so he could see firsthand what was there in the depths. However, there was a requirement. He would never be the same after he descended and saw. He would have to decide whether to join those who guarded the secrets or to spend the rest of his life trying to forget something that was impossible to forget, because the experience would permanently change his mind. There was no way to see those facts and not care. There was no middle ground. That offer weighed heavily on the merchant. A part of him wanted to say no, wanted to express gratitude for, their hospitality, and depart as soon as possible. However, the other part of him, the insatiable curiosity that had kept him in Mielheim for weeks, hinted that this was the chance he had been looking for all along. It was an opportunity to witness what few people had ever seen, to comprehend mysteries beyond the realms of science and religion, and to discover what the cost of true knowledge was. The patriarch held up his hand and said that the merchant did not have to respond right away before he could decide. He could stay the night on the farm, relax and think about the decision he had to make. The family would set up a room for him where he could think freely. They would lead him down into the caves at dawn if he still desired to do so. They wouldn't stop him if he chose to go. Even so, they were aware that curiosity would eventually resurrect him, if not physically, then at least through the dreams that were already starting to infiltrate his thoughts. The proposal was accepted by the merchant. They escorted him to a chamber on the... In contrast to the rest of the house, the second floor is a remarkably ordinary area. There was a window with a view of the far-off mountains, a candle for light, and a plain but tidy bed. When he was by himself, he sat on the bed and attempted to comprehend all he had discovered over the previous few hours. His perspective had been broadened beyond his wildest expectations, and now he had to make a decision that would impact not just his future, but also, perhaps, his humanity. He peered out the window as night descended on the farm and observed amidst the trees, familiar lights dance. But now that he understood the situation, they appeared melancholic instead of menacing, like lone watchmen carrying out a duty that no one else wanted to acknowledge. The family below carried on with their never-ending labor, maintaining barriers and keeping portals closed so that the surface world could carry on with its contented and naive way of life. Someone had to make the sacrifice, even though no one asked them to. The businessman reclined on the bed, but he was aware that sleep would be challenging that evening. His thoughts were racing, analyzing arguments, thinking through the ramifications, and attempting to predict futures that hinged on a decision he hadn't yet made. From below, he could hear his family's gentle footsteps getting ready for another night's vigil, as well as an almost undetectable echo of something huge and ancient pulsing in the earth's depths somewhere farther away, far beneath the house. After a while, sleep arrived, but it brought no rest. The businessman started having dreams that were more vivid than anything he had ever experienced while awake. He moved through corridors of stone that went on forever in all directions, lit by a faint phosphorescence that came from the walls themselves. Everything was visible in a ghostly clarity that revealed impossible details, but there was no discernible source of light. Engravings that told stories in a visual language that his conscious mind shouldn't comprehend, but that made perfect sense in dreams, were all over the walls. He witnessed scenes from the past, periods when non-human animals roamed the earth freely and things were different. He witnessed the building of underground tunnels using methods that bent reality itself and carved spaces into dimensions that would not typically intersect with the material world, rather than by human hands. He witnessed the initial human discovery of these structures, their fear gradually turning into awe and then into something more sophisticated, and their realization that these abnormalities were neither good nor evil, but they just existed in accordance with logics that went beyond human morality. He descended farther and farther in the dream, going through levels that appeared to correspond to both altered states of consciousness and physical depth. Every level was distinct from the one before it, and was controlled by slightly altered physical laws. Gravity fluctuated. At times it was nearly non-existent, allowing him to float through the enormous underground passageways, and at other times it pulled him down with crushing force. Additionally, time behaved. Oddly, hours passed in the blink of an eye, and moments seemed to last for hours. In one of those deep levels he located the missing geologist. The man was sitting on a rock formation with his instruments strewn all over the place, writing frantically in notebooks that seemed to grow out of control all around him. The geologist ignored the merchant's attempts to communicate with him, acting as though he couldn't see him or that the merchant was just one of many things that existed. Concurrently in that area, the geologist muttered equations that combined symbols from no human notation system with well-known mathematical concepts. The merchant saw other figures there as well, but they disappeared when he attempted to focus on them directly. They were the shadows of individuals who had come down over decades, if not centuries, each in search of knowledge and discovering something that fundamentally altered who they were. Some of these numbers are still ambiguously retained. Others had evolved into something other than human forms, adapting in ways that defied accepted biology to the strange environment of the caves. In the dream, he traveled even farther, to a place where caverns opened into an expansive area with no discernible boundaries. It was similar to being suspended in a vacuum, but everything was infused with a huge, all-pervasive consciousness. He was unable to identify its physical form, but he could feel its attention like the weight of innumerable invisible eyes observing him with interest from a distance. Its very existence was overwhelming, like trying to understand the ocean while only a single drop of water, but its presence wasn't hostile. In spite of the chilly night air, he woke up suddenly in his farmhouse bedroom, sweat all over his body. The pre-dawn gray light was starting to seep through the window, and the candle had completely burned out. He was momentarily unable to tell if he had actually woken up or if he was still dreaming. Both realities appeared to be equally real and legitimate. He sat up, his hands shaking in bed, attempting to clearly process the pictures and feelings that were still pulsing through his head. He realized now that his decision had already been made, possibly even earlier, when he chose to stay in Mielheim in spite of all the cautions when he consented to enter the farm. The dream had been more than just a dream. It had been an initiation, a sneak peek, preparing his mind for what lay ahead. He would go down into the caverns not because he was courageous or stupid, but rather because he had passed a threshold where curiosity became compulsion, which turned into fate. His family was already assembled when he descended the stairs, seemingly anticipating his awakening. The patriarch acknowledged the decision reflected in his eyes and nodded. There were only pragmatic preparations, no more words of caution or explanation. They provided him with clothing that was better suited for the descent, made of the peculiar substance the seamstress had spoken about, which absorbed light and kept his body temperature steady no matter the surroundings. They also gave him a strange lantern with a blue flame that never wavered or flickered. The merchant was guided by the patriarch to the cellar, which he had only observed from the outside. The interior, which had been altered over decades with metal and wooden supports to keep the structure stable, was precisely as he had envisioned a direct access to the natural caves. Each beam had symbols carved into it, safeguards the family felt were essential to preserving some kind of authority over the energy emanating from those depths. The merchant recalled that strange odor from his first visit, and the air rising from the caves was heavy and chilly. They started down a staircase that appeared to have undergone numerous renovations over the years, with each generation making its own additions. Initially, it was nothing more than natural rock, moist walls covered in lichen and moss that shimmered slightly in the flashlight. However, as they went down, the wall's characteristics started to shift. Sections appeared. That obviously wasn't a natural formation. Stone blocks that had been cut with unfathomable accuracy and assembled without mortar were smooth to the touch and somewhat warm, as though they were holding on to heat from an internal source. As they descended, the patriarch gave a brief explanation, highlighting particular aspects of the caves. He displayed signs on the walls that denoted safety levels, areas where the depth's influence was lessened, and where people could stay for long stretches of time without suffering long-term harm. These safeguards vanished farther down, he cautioned, and every minute that passed raised the possibility of irrevocable change. Through generations of meticulous investigation and selflessness, the family had charted these areas. They went through rooms that the family had transformed into work areas, where they carried out their routine maintenance. The merchant observed improvised altars adorned with items that combined symbols from various cultures, including Christian, indigenous, and others he was unfamiliar with. Everybody fused into a practical synthesis that put utility ahead of tradition. There were handwritten manuscripts recording methods and observations from earlier generations, as well as ancient books preserved in airtight boxes. It was a library of prohibited knowledge that was kept up out of survival need rather than academic aspiration. The merchant started to notice the changes the patriarch had mentioned as they descended further. There was an increasing pressure in his mind, not in his ears, as though thoughts that weren't his own were attempting to enter the gaps in his conscious thoughts. In the flashlight's shadows, he noticed patterns, shapes that hinted at meanings that his traditional upbringing had not equipped him to decipher. The patriarch gave him instructions to concentrate on his breathing and to keep his thoughts grounded in fundamental bodily sensations strategies the family had created to negotiate these transformed environments. At last, they reached a room that the patriarch referred to as the frontier, the boundary beyond which he could no longer act as a trustworthy manual. It had multiple passageways opening in various directions and was a circular area about 30 meters in diameter. Deeper areas with unique features and risks were reached by each passage. According to the patriarch, the merchant would then have to make his own decisions based solely on his instincts and the knowledge he had both consciously and unconsciously gained from his time on the farm. He indicated each passage and gave a brief explanation of what was known about them. One led to galleries where walking in a straight line could produce impossible circles as geometry started to behave in a non-Euclidean manner. Another went down to places where time was erratic, where minutes could become hours, or the other way around. The third, narrowest passageway led to the lowest levels, where the merchant's dreamlike presence lived in its most concentrated form. The patriarch made it apparent that he did not anticipate the merchant coming back in the same manner. The transformation was unavoidable. It was only a question of direction and degree. Eventually, some of the people who went down came back to the surface, but they carried with them changes that made it impossible for them to fully reintegrate into society. Others made the decision to stay in the depths because they discovered something in the caves that the outside world could never provide, whether it was wisdom, meaning, or just a way of life that more closely matched something fundamental to who they were. After expressing gratitude to the patriarch for his leadership, the merchant stood by himself in the border chamber, weighing his options. His lantern's light created dancing shadows on the walls, and he could hear far-off echoes emanating from every passageway. These sounds could be wind rushing through tunnels, water dripping, or something completely different that, in the absence of appropriate references, his mind translated into familiar terms. He was aware that the next step would be final, and that passing through any of those passages would entail accepting a change from which there would be no real way out. The vendor stayed in that border chamber for an indeterminate amount of time. His understanding of time had started to warp. His linear sense of time seemed to be defied by the way minutes stretched and compressed. He carefully read each passage in an attempt to determine which one spoke to him the most deeply and which one struck a chord with his innermost thoughts. It was not a decision that could be decided by reason alone. It was a decision that had to originate from a more primal, visceral aspect of himself that seldom had a voice in the world of rationality. In the end, he decided on the passage in the middle, the one the patriarch had said led to the galleries of changed geometry. Although he was unable to pinpoint the precise reason for his attraction to this option, there was something in the description that piqued his interest. Patterns and the way reality arranged itself into underlying mathematical structures had always captivated him, and the thought of a place where these basic laws operated differently was alluring despite the clear danger. The passage started out seemingly normal, a straight tunnel with smooth, slightly warm walls that descended at a gentle angle. But over time, he started to pick up on minute discrepancies. His flashlight's light created shadows that were not exactly in line with the shapes of the rocks, as though object and shadow were not the same thing, or as though they were on slightly different planes of reality. The echoes of his footsteps came from unexpected places, not only from the front or rear, but also from the sides and above, as though the sound were bouncing off invisible surfaces. These distortions became more noticeable the farther he traveled. The tunnel started to curve in ways that were not consistent with its spatial layout. He was certain that he would fall. Even though he could feel gravity pulling him down, he would sometimes experience a brief dizziness when he realized that his idea of down had evolved without his knowledge. It seemed as though space itself were folding back on themselves, forming paths that, depending on how they were viewed, existed concurrently in several orientations. His mind, which had been trained in Euclidean geometry, found it difficult to comprehend the topology of the vast gallery where the walls curved in incredibly sharp ways. From the floor to the ceiling there were columns. However, he found that they connected in paradoxical ways when he attempted to follow their vertical lines with his eyes, with a single column acting as support at a number of locations that ought to be far apart. It resembled an acre staircase brought to life in 3 dimensions, but without the use of perspective tricks. That was how the room actually behaved. Sitting on what appeared to be a stable rock formation, the merchant attempted to record his observations in a notebook he had brought along, but he found that such structures could not be drawn on 2-dimensional paper. Every attempt to depict the space's geometry produced sketches that were inconsistent with themselves, lines that were obviously connected in the reality in front of him, but were unable to connect as he perceived them. He finally grasped one of the lessons the patriarch had attempted to teach him at that point. Knowledge that existed only in direct experience and vanished when pushed into traditional frameworks was one of the experiences that could not be translated back into the language and concepts of the surface. He spent hours, maybe days, looking around that gallery. The distinction had become meaningless. He discovered smaller rooms, each having unique geometric features and branching off from the main one. Depending on the viewpoint, one's walls appeared to be both concave and convex at the same time. Another had a ceiling that was both above and below it at the same time, making it difficult for him to find his way around. In some areas, he could touch walls that appeared to be meters away, and in others, surfaces that looked to be next to each other were separated by distances that took minutes to cross. He started discovering artifacts, items left by people who had been there before him during these explorations. Symbols etched into rock surfaces that blended languages from various cultures and eras, metal tools tainted by time, and sometimes personal items. A pocket watch stopped at an impractical moment. Pieces of clothing that broke apart when touched. Notes on pieces of paper that were initially readable, but eventually changed into abstract designs as the author. He seemed to have lost the ability to put his ideas into words. These remnants of past human habitation were both reassuring and disturbing. Reassuring because they demonstrated that he wasn't the first person to walk those paths, and that others had lived long enough to leave traces of their journey. They were unsettling because they implied that many of these earlier explorers had never made it back to the surface, and had instead permanently integrated themselves into that underground maze of altered reality. The businessman questioned whether he, He would ultimately become just another collection of artifacts to be found and considered by a future explorer. He first encountered something that could not be accounted for as a simple perceptual distortion or geological anomaly during one of these explorations. He stepped into what at first glance appeared to be an empty chamber, just another oddly shaped room. However, as he approached the center, he sensed a presence that was both real and non-physical, occupying the area in a manner that did not involve matter in the common sense. It was as though one were in the presence of an enormous and ancient consciousness that had been there for all of recorded time, watching, waiting, and maybe even picking up knowledge from those who occasionally entered its realm. Neither words nor even distinct images could adequately convey this presence. Rather, the merchant experienced first-hand impressions in his mind, ideas that transcended language entirely and became instantaneous understandings. He knew without being able to articulate how he came to that conclusion. This entity, which was in some ways a part of the cave's actual structure, was aware of everything that occurred in those tunnels. It wasn't a creature in the sense that it was created or born. It was something that had developed organically from the unusual circumstances of that location. A life form that is as dissimilar from surface biology as water and stone. It appeared to be as interested in him as he was in it. In that encounter, there was a sense of mutual exploration. Two drastically dissimilar forms of consciousness, seeking areas of shared understanding and common ground despite coming from such disparate backgrounds. The merchant attempted to create questions in his mind, but discovered that the idea of a question and answer was insufficient for that type of communication. Rather, information flowed more directly and unstructuredly, with insights appearing on their own without the need for explicit solicitation. Through this interaction, he started to comprehend some of the aspects of that establishment's operations that had been totally opaque previously. Instead of occurring at random, the geometric distortions followed intricate patterns associated with the energy fields that were present in the rocks. Depending on a person's sensitivity and open-mindedness, these fields could interact with human consciousness in subtle or dramatic ways. Through their rituals, the family had developed the ability to navigate and even control these fields over many generations, establishing areas of relative stability where they could remain vigilant without being totally changed. The merchant also got a glimpse of the place's long history, back before humans, when the planet was young and pliable, and the boundaries between the various dimensions of reality were less clear-cut than they are today. Those caves were remnants of that ancient period, possibly portals or scars. Locations where the universe's fabric had never completely solidified into the stable configurations necessary for the existence of typical life. Maintaining these locations' seclusion and controlled was not just about protecting people, but also about maintaining the foundation of reality as we know it. The merchant was physically and psychologically worn out when the contact finally ended. It seemed as though all of his body's cells and all of his brain's neurons had been overworked. With his flashlight flickering faintly next to him, he lay on the chamber floor and let himself fall into a state that was neither completely asleep nor fully awake. Awake, he processed everything he had encountered in that mental state, rearranging his thoughts to make room for information that did not fit into his pre-existing conceptual frameworks. He was unsure of how much time had gone by when he eventually got to his feet, but he felt as though he had changed radically. He was undoubtedly not the same person who had descended from Pennsylvania's snow-capped mountains, but it wasn't the drastic and alienating change the patriarch had warned was possible. He is now. Held recollections of impossible things, of places that shouldn't be there, and of consciousnesses that functioned on a basis wholly unrelated to the realities of everyday life. The merchant started back down the twisting tunnels, on a course that his intuition now appeared to be able to follow more clearly. The geometric irregularities that had previously confused him now made sense in a different way, as though his mind had evolved new ways of perceiving those. Impossible without giving up. He moved through the tunnels with a confidence that came from a deeper, more intuitive understanding of how that space operated, rather than from intellectual knowledge. He thought about all he had seen and experienced during the climb. On the surface, the farm with its family of silent guardians and its nightly rituals now showed itself to be merely the outermost layer of something much larger and more intricate. It served as the meeting point of two worlds and the intersection of conventional reality, dimensions that followed entirely different guidelines, and that family, in all its strangeness and seclusion, was just trying to keep this encounter under control and under control. When he considered the geologist who had vanished, he realized that the man had most likely discovered something in the depths that resonated so profoundly with his fundamental nature that going back to the surface just didn't make sense. It wasn't about being lost or trapped in the traditional sense, but rather about having found a way of living that provided pleasures that were unattainable in the real world. This realization was depressing, but it was also oddly beautiful to think that reality and consciousness could coexist in such different ways. The patriarch was waiting for him when he eventually made his way back into the frontier chamber, seemingly anticipating his return. Even though the changes weren't immediately apparent, the elderly man acknowledged them by nodding approvingly and looking into his eyes. Together, they ascended in silence, the merchant returning to increasingly higher levels of normalcy with each step, even though he was aware that his perception of reality would never be precisely the same. The family had made a simple dinner at the farmhouse. The merchant saw them for the first time as people bearing a burden that no one should have to bear alone, rather than as evil or frightening entities, as they sat together around a weathered wooden table. They had a silent communion, sharing food and a few stray words. Between those who were able to see past the veils that typically conceal the most profound aspects of life. The patriarch clarified that the merchant now had to make a decision that was both straightforward and extremely difficult. He could depart and attempt to return to his previous life, keeping his newfound understanding as a personal secret that would permanently alter his outlook on the world. Alternatively, he could decide to remain, become a member of the Watch, and join the group of guardians who continuously monitored those portals. There was no condemnation in either option. Each had a unique value and sacrifice. On the farm, the merchant thought about this choice for 2 more days. He strolled around the grounds, took in the far-off snow-capped mountains, and breathed in the crisp air that smelled of frozen earth and pine. A part of him yearned for normalcy, for the straightforward activities of trade and travel, for conversations in taverns about unremarkable subjects that didn't pose a threat to reality's foundations. However, there was also a portion that acknowledged this, a sense of superficiality. A theater of unimportant issues presented on a stage would always permeate normalcy. He now realized that he was much weaker and more peculiar than most people would ever realize. At last, he decided what to do. In addition to thanking the family for their hospitality and the revelation, he stated that he needed to get back to the outside world in order to try to live with his newfound knowledge without becoming totally engrossed in it. The patriarch recognized and honored this option. He assured the merchant that the farm's doors would be open to him in a manner not available to others, and that he would always be welcome to return if he changed his mind. The patriarch gave him a small, item-a-smooth, dark stone that had been taken out of the deep caverns before departing. He claimed that it served as a reminder and a safeguard, an anchor that would support him when the memories of the depths became too much to bear. With gratitude, the merchant accepted the gift, experiencing the pleasant, odd weight of the rock he was holding. Its surface felt a little warm, as though it held a subtle energy. The return trip to Mielheim was lonesome and reflective. With a single glance back, the merchant saw the farm disappear into the distance, its smoke spiraling into the gloomy winter sky. Generation after generation, that location would carry on its silent work, guarding secrets that the rest of the world would prefer to remain unaware of. Additionally, dozens of similar locations were dispersed throughout the mountains, each with its own guardian families, each guarding a portion of the brittle veil separating realities. Upon his arrival at the boarding house, the landlady gave him a startled yet relieved look. She had nearly lost hope that he would come back. The letters he had left were still retained, but they were only sent in the event of a protracted absence rather than as he had requested. Without reading them, he took them out and set them on fire, deciding that some knowledge was too risky to be widely documented and that those records shouldn't exist. Circulated. For a few more days, the merchant stayed in Mielheim, taking care of business and getting ready to depart permanently. He became aware that his perception of the village had changed, that he was now able to notice details in the people and surroundings that he had not before. Some residents had a network of implicit knowledge, a common comprehension of the farm and its ramifications that was never discussed in public but subtly influenced many choices and actions. He understood that the world was full of these hidden layers, secrets inside secrets now. Every community is protecting its own local secrets. He didn't turn around when he eventually left, following the paths that would take him far away from those mountains. He brought with him insights about the nature of reality that would change his perspective on the world forever, as well as memories that could not be erased by physical distance. He would resume his life as a merchant, visiting farms and cities to exchange goods and hear tales. However, he now heard these tales with a distinct focus, identifying parallels and reverberations with the lessons he had discovered deep within. As a result, the merchant tale merges with innumerable other tales that surface from Pennsylvania's mountains, each of which contains hints of more profound realities that are rarely fully disclosed. The farm remains in its perpetual watch. The family is carrying out its responsibilities through customs that very few people comprehend and even fewer value. The caverns are still deep within, their impossibly complex geometries and extraterrestrial presences unaffected by the passing of time in a superficial way. Curious enough to descend and courageous enough to return changed, they patiently await the next adventurers. The mountains are good at keeping their secrets. From prehistoric times to the ever-evolving present, layers of mystery have accumulated over time, and there are still places where reality is thinner, where other dimensions press against the fabric of the known world, between their deep valleys and snow-capped peaks, between their folds of stone and forest. Only by the unwavering watchfulness of those who have taken on this responsibility. There were many tales to be told about those ancient lands and their silent vigils, this being just one. For more in-depth looks at the shadows that lurk on the edges of our reality, think about subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed this voyage through Pennsylvania's mysteries. Share your thoughts in a comment, and until the next tale that lifts the veil of ordinary life.